The security of sensitive data within the federal government remains a top concern. With the ever-present threat of insider breaches, cyber attacks, and the growth of valuable data, federal agencies are facing unprecedented challenges in safeguarding critical information. I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group, and here to talk about the state of data security in the government and the complex landscape of federal information protection is Justin Wilkins, Director of Sales Engineering at Varonis. Justin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first, I'd like to ask, what is the current landscape of insider threats and their impact on sensitive data in the federal government?
So historically, a lot of the investment has been made in keeping people outside of the network. And there's been less of a focus on actually protecting the data that lives within the network. And the reason why this is a challenge is because attackers are becoming more sophisticated. Things like social engineering and phishing are still remarkably effective. And what we've seen, even in larger agencies that have very good security programs, is that when they're running these phishing simulations, at least 1% of users are clicking on these links and actually entering in their credentials. And the reason why this is an issue is because if you think about the scale of the problem, 1% of users entering in their credentials, some agencies have thousands or even hundreds of thousands of users, that becomes a giant vector for attack. And what happens is you have a ton of infiltration points, and it's really a matter of when, not if. And so the idea is that we need to shift our focus from keeping people outside of the network to focusing on what's actually happening inside of an organization. So we talk about this concept of blast radius at Varonis, and I'll expound on that later on in the conversation. But ultimately, far more data is exposed to users than necessary, and it creates a big challenge because we really have no ability to secure it.
What's your answer to the question of whether cyber attacks are just an inevitable cost of doing business?
So as I mentioned earlier, I think it's inevitability. So organizations are adopting cloud repositories to enable and facilitate collaboration. We have complex workflows. The data is in multiple locations. You have generative AI tools that are making data even more accessible to individuals. So it's really inevitability. It's a matter of when, not if. And if you look at an insider threat, they're by definition already inside of the network. So what do we really need to be doing? Number one, we need to be reducing our blast radius. So I mentioned that concept earlier. So in a typical organization, for example, we run thousands of risk assessments across both the private and public sector every year, and we publish an annual global data risk report that highlights risk in SaaS applications as well as large data sets. And we find that the average organization has 20% of the data wide open. 1 of every 10 files in SaaS applications are open to everyone in the organization. We have a lot of content exposed to external parties, so users outside of the organization. So the idea is that we need to take that blast radius, we need to restrict the data exclusively to authorized users. And that's going to go a long way at limiting the damage that could be caused in the event of a breach. The second thing is really monitoring how users are behaving. So the goal is to reduce the uncertainty and limit the attacker's window of opportunity. So if I have visibility of what they're doing across all my data stores, from authentication all the way to the data access, I now have an advantage because I know everything that they're doing, and I can detect those attacks further to the left of the kill chain. So for us, it's pretty simple. It's making sure that you're focusing in the right place, protecting data, because ultimately attacks are coming from multiple directions, but they're all heading in one direction, that is the data itself. So if we have increased visibility, we're monitoring what users are doing, and we're reducing our blast radius, we're going to significantly limit the damage that could be caused in the event of an incident.
How do you think the government's zero trust policies are playing a role in safeguarding critical information in the government sector?
So I think it's done a great job of really codifying those things that I mentioned earlier. So making sure that data and resources are accessible only to authorized users, and then monitoring what they're doing. If you look at zero trust, what happens is you have all of your sensitive data classified and labeled. It's very important because you can't begin to protect it if you don't know where it exists. You then have this concept of a policy enforcement point and a policy decision point where when a user is accessing a resource, that access is being brokered based on the identity, based on the data, based on the risk. So we have that just-in-time access model to ensure that users are only able to access authorized resources. And then we have that continuous monitoring. So through the analytics, we have that feedback loop that's telling us if this user's behavior should continue to be trusted. So what we've done is we've restricted access to what a user requires for his or her job. And then we have the monitoring capabilities to understand when we have users behaving suspiciously, and that's going to help us detect not only adversaries and compromised accounts, but also things like insider threats. Right? So I think organizations that fully implement zero trust will have a significantly improved security posture. And really, if you look at CISA's guidance, the goal of zero trust is to take a data-centric approach and directly from CISA to protect critical data and services. So if you look at the DoD CIO model, I feel like they've done a very good job of codifying what zero trust means for these agencies and developing prescriptive requirements across the DoD that says this is what you need to do to implement zero trust, and then they're vetting this architecture out through red team exercises. So I think zero trust is taking what we should have been doing all along and putting it into a requirement.
So one of the big challenges, of course, is that government has massive amounts of data. So collaborating and creating data, is even increasing that ever more. Can effective data governance be established in your mind to enable secure data classification and labeling and controlled access to authorized personnel?
So the answer is yes. I think the problem is really difficult. I mean, if you look at the explosion of cloud resource, especially during COVID, where organizations began to adopt more and more cloud repositories, they enabled remote workflows, data is continuing to grow at least 20 to 30% each and every year. And so you have complex data stores, you have increased risk of collaboration, and really no ability to even start by understanding where we have our most sensitive assets and then ultimately what we need to do to protect them. I talked about generative AI earlier, but what generative AI is doing, especially tools like ChatGPT and Copilot, is they're now making data very accessible to users. So if you look at something like Microsoft Copilot, any data that's accessible to a user is going to be a part of that model. It's going to be part of that information product. And now this could be available to adversaries or malicious insiders that seek to cause harm. So I think if you're going to implement a successful data classification and labeling program, it starts by understanding where we have the most sensitive data. And we actually worked with a large federal agency that I would say is successful at this. They were able to go out and classify all their sensitive data, so they know where all their PII and CUI data, that's what they're focused on. They then applied labels, so automatically applying those labels, and they used the labels and the classification to work with business stakeholders to identify what policies needed to be enforced on that information. They were then able to restrict access to information. So based on the users that are authorized to access the sensitive content, making sure it was locked down. So taking that blast radius, we have 20% of data wide open in every organization, 1 out of every 10 files and SaaS applications are exposed to everybody internally, and restricting that exclusively to the authorized individuals. They were then able to monitor all the activity, so they're able to understand when users are behaving suspiciously before that data leaves the network. And by the way, they're now able to put policies in place to do things like RMS and encryption to ensure that if it leaves, it's still protected. And by simply starting with understanding the risk that they were managing, classifying the data, applying appropriate labels, working with business stakeholders to identify what policies needed to apply to those labels, they're able to build a successful data governance program, and the outcome was that their security posture was dramatically improved because the right people had access to the right data, and they were able to monitor what users were doing in a way that a lot of organizations can't today.
And then finally, Justin, what additional recommendations would you offer federal agencies seeking to enhance their data security posture and protect this sensitive information more effectively?
So I think it's exactly what that agency did that I mentioned earlier. So if an organization wants to be successful at solving this problem, they need to focus on the data first. So you need to understand where all your sensitive data is. So this could be PII, PHI, CUI information. It could be data that's specific to your agency. So understanding and inventorying all that data, understanding who has access to information, so mapping out all the access rights, all the privileges and entitlements, looking at risky configurations in SaaS applications, things like third-party apps, or any potential risks within those applications that could expose data to users that should never have access to it. Automating the remediation of that risk, so going out and making sure that things like global group access and sensitive data is controlled, remediating external access to sensitive content and making sure that we don't have any data exposed in the public domain. And then building a solution that is allowing organizations to automate the activity monitoring, performing analytics. If you look at M2131, It's a part of the executive order that is required, and then feeding that into a bigger ecosystem so that way they understand what users are doing, they're correlating everything together, and they're able to see anomalies before they start. Because remember, it's a matter of when, not if, and if I'm monitoring what users are doing, I'm in a good position to, remember, reduce the uncertainty, improve my visibility, and ultimately limit the amount of time that an attacker has to cause damage. And if that blast radius is reduced, what I've now done is effectively limited what an account has access to, what a user has access to, and if that account is compromised, there's going to be far less damage, and that's really important.
Well, Justin Wilkins, thank you very much for joining us and sharing some of your insights on ways to better protect the government's data.
Thank you very much for having me.